Namaskar, everyone. Okay. As introduced, my name is Takeshi Komino. I serve as the Secretary General of ADRN, and I'm delighted to be here today. And thank you very much for everyone who's organizing this event. In fact, I've been to Nepal first time, I think it was back in 2003.
Okay.
And it was my last year in my university. And I was, thinking about what I should do after my graduation. And so I decided to take a trip. It was like a 1-month trip around Asia. During this journey, I visited Nepal for the first time. And I was truly astonished by the beauty of your country. And I always envied you all for having such a beautiful country. I remember flying into Kathmandu and also looking around outside of Kathmandu, and just natural beauty really struck me. I started my career in this sector from Afghanistan back in 2004, and then shifted a little bit to the eastwards. I worked in Pakistan, Myanmar, Thailand, and back in 2011, there was a East Japan earthquake and tsunami with the nuclear power plant accident in Japan, which brought me back to Japan. And since then, I started to work in Japan as well. And since 2015, I'm permanently based in Japan, and now I live in Kobe. I've been involved in this network, ADRN, since about 2008, 2009. And with people like Amot-san, there are these leaders from many countries in Asia who have been active in the civil society space. And it's such a pleasure to be learning from colleagues like that in the region. So ADRN is really in my heart, and I'm really happy to be serving the network now. So today I would like to talk about what ADRN does, but also what our recent thinking is around how to tackle our imminent challenges. And I really look forward to the discussion session, because I think many of you may be in the same generation as I am, or even younger. And I think this massive challenge of climate risks, as well as subsequent disaster risks that we face, and you are currently facing with the flooding and landslides that you're facing, people on the ground would require solution to their disaster risk challenges. And we need to figure out how to do that. So I really look forward to our discussion session. Now, ADRN, we have this vision, as Amot-san explained. Every time people talk about disasters and in Asia, they start out, and I would also start out by saying, well, Asia is the most disaster-prone region in the world. And it's true. But our vision for Asia is that we would like to have this region being explained or introduced as the most resilient region in the world, instead of just the most disaster-prone region in the world. So by 2030 is the year that the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, for example, or the Paris Agreement, or Sustainable Development Goals aim towards. And so our vision for 2030 is that we want Asia to be the most disaster resilient region in the world. And one of the ways that we try to do that is through these hubs that you see on the screen. Hubs are sort of like thematic groups owned by our membership. And these hubs operate based on the specific technical expertise. For example, the Earthquake Risk Management Hub hosted by NSET is specializing in this earthquake risk management. And it caters to the needs of other membership around the region. We also have colleagues from Philippines who are hosting community-based disaster risk reduction and management hub. We have colleagues from Pakistan looking into the quality and accountability, so international standards in humanitarian response, for example. So they host this hub. And we host also Innovation Hub in Tokyo. And you know, ADRN members actually come from different disciplines. So some are medical doctors, for example. Some are civil engineers, sociologists, architects, IT personnel. We have people from different disciplines. And we believe that by is going to be renewed this year. But the key essences are that we try to be the voice of civil society in Asia. So the concerns that people have on the ground, that needs to be amplified in the policy dialogue, for example, at the regional level, the global level, and we try to be that voice. We also want to make sure that to link the global frameworks with national and local actions. Because sometimes these discussions around the global frameworks is done without the knowledge of what's actually happening on the ground. And there are local champions who already do most of these disaster risk reduction work on the ground. And that need to be recognized in the regional and the global dialogue. And we try to amplify these voices as well. And we aim to strengthen the sector and innovate for further impact, which we will talk a little bit more about in the coming slides. Our membership, so we have over 50 members representing, the membership itself is representing about 17 countries, but with our partners, we have a coverage of about 20 countries in the region. And we also proactively establish partnership with our stakeholders. For example, the Humanitarian Innovation Fund from ERA, the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. We also partner with UN agencies like OCHA and UNDRR, ADPC in Bangkok, other civil society networks like GNDR or JCC-DRR, START Network or MAP Action, and of course the academia like colleagues from Sajak, Nepal, including Durham University, for example. Some of the things that we do, some to highlight. For example, we do something called the Regional NGO Partnership Week. It was a once a year face-to-face event, but during the COVID time, it became all virtual. And the last year we did it all online. But this event has been going on since 2016. And it's actually ADRN had this annual general assembly meeting every year, and it transformed into more of a multi-stakeholder event where hundreds of stakeholders actually participate. And there are people from different disciplines, academia, practitioners, donors, and international organizations who attend this event. And it often leads to exploration of further collaboration. And we organize these events with ICVA and the UN OCHA as well. ADRN is also a civil society convener at Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, APMCDRR in short. And we have an event called the Local Leaders Forum. And it started out with the ministerial conference that was held in Delhi some years back, We continued that in 2018 Mongolia, AMC-DRR as well. And this is actually a venue where we do our advocacy. So there are these local leaders, local champions. You know, sometimes it's a shopkeeper, or it's sometimes a teacher, sometimes a local mayor, who's making sure that the hazards don't turn into disasters. And in this event, we call national leaders, like the ministers, like the UN Special Representative on DRR. And these national leaders celebrate the local leaders on their achievement on disaster risk reduction. And we love this event because this is sort of like a paradigm shift in a sense. You know, usually these national leaders come to these ministerial conference, people pay respect for their leadership. But in this event, it's opposite. These national leaders are paying respect to the local leaders who are champions in disaster risk reduction. So this is also something that we do. We also publish these communique. This is the one published in 2018 on the climate change impact, focusing on the local action and innovation. And this was one of the product of the discussion that we had in that 2018 annual event. Some publications we also make with our academia friends and colleagues. So some of these things, if you can Google it, I think you will find a link on the Prevention Web or AlertNet or some other links. Yeah. Okay. And these also includes the lessons from the recent disasters. And because we think it's critical to learn from these each disaster events in order to reduce the risks for the future. Okay, so enough about ADRN and what we do. Let's take a little look at the risk landscape. And again, Asia is affected significantly from disasters. We all know that. And with climate change impact, the hydrometeorological disasters like flooding, like typhoons are on the rise. And also climatological disasters like drought are also impacting the region significantly. And I was just hearing that Nepal is now experiencing unfortunate chain of events from the monsoon rain to the flooding, landslides, and people are losing their assets and unfortunately lives as well. The frequency of such hydrometeorological disasters are on the rise, and with further global warming, it's expected to become worse and worse. In Japan also, we're now geared up to respond to annual flooding disasters because it seems from our experience that it happens every year now. Back in 2016, when Japan hosted G7 meeting, Japanese government asked a think tank in Germany called Adelphi to look at the cascading impact of climate risks. So they call it a climate fragility. And basically, it looks at the chain reaction of various risks. And UNDRR is doing more research on this now, but looking at from the temperature change to how it changes the evaporation patterns of water in the sea. How does that link affect the cloud formation patterns and the rainfall patterns, and then the flooding or the landslides and so on. If we remember, before the current Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction was put in place in 2015, we had the international framework called the HILO Framework for Action from 2005 to 2015. And they had 5 priorities for action, as you see on the slide now. But you know, when people have reviewed the achievements of the HILO Framework for Action, priority for action, the priority for action number 4, underlining risk factors, score the lowest. And this is because when we think about underlining risk factors, so the factors that make hazards turn into disasters, it's very complex. It's a complex interrelations between pre-existing conditions of the people, socioeconomic conditions of the people, and the hazard event itself, and how that gets interacted and how that gets impacted is required to see. And that's quite a complex thing to do, and therefore it scored the lowest. Now, but some of the specific challenges in Asia nowadays, for example, the rainfall pattern is changing for sure, but the infrastructure that we have is still from the 20th century. And we understand very well that this 20th century infrastructure was built with this forecast of the amount of rain or amount of the river water level and so on and so forth from our forecast from a while ago. But the current weather is actually exceeding what we have been planning. And so how to cope with this 21st century weather pattern, the rainfall pattern, is a significant challenge. It's also becoming a common norm nowadays, even in Japan, that you know, we have been relying on quite a lot on infrastructure for river basin management. But now the ministry people who has been in charge of that, leading these national projects, are also saying, with the current rainfall pattern, infrastructure is not the answer anymore. We have to look at the whole societal solution. And we need to have that perspective. But of course, the million-dollar question is how to have that perspective. There's emergence of widespread water scarcity and also a more frequent flood. So it poses a challenge on the water management at various levels. There's a need for more early action. You know, some people say anticipatory action, but the when and the where to start is still a question mark. There's intensified and more complex interrelations of risks in urban areas. There's increase in shocks and stresses. The climate risks are leading to political and social risks as well. You know, in many countries, we see the national sort of setup and how the governance mechanism of the risks, which are very much response focused. But I think in this era, we are expected to come up with solutions in order to reduce the risks tangibly for the people on the ground. And many of these risks are regional. It's never, the risk doesn't stop at the border. So in the COVID era, I think the trend is changing nowadays a bit, but some of the countries were really nationalizing their perspective. But I think we need to have more of a shared risk perspective between the countries. And COVID is a great example. I think this is the risk that we all share in the whole world. So it's not a competition, but it's really about the coexistence in this century. We're looking at the evolution from the HILO Framework for Action, Sendai Framework, and the current COVID-19 era. The importance of the local governance of risks are emphasized more and more. And in fact, you know, I was just discussing this with Motto-san before this event started. COVID-19, the actual risk of COVID is personalized. It depends, it's different from person to person. And therefore, and that's why it's difficult. You know, for some people, they may think the risk for them is similar to the ones that they have from other seasonal influenza. But for others, it's deadly. You know, so it's really different from person to person. But how to put that into the policy and how to put that into practice is really a big question that we're all trying to answer. In Japan, it's also chaotic. But looking at this local governance is quite important, because when we take a look at each phase of the disaster management, we know that the majority of the things are done or to be done locally, more so in the current COVID-19 situation. For example, how different services are delivered locally would determine the overall effectiveness of the response. Increasingly, people will be scattered in their evacuation patterns in this COVID era. So local management really becomes the key. But how to empower that local governance is really a consideration. Health and hygiene practices needs to be optimized as per each locality and condition. And we need to avoid the secondary disasters from happening in these places. The recovery, you know, recovery is a very vague word, because we understand that the recovery scenario for each of the locality is different. You know, recovery strategy, it needs to be different from place to place, because their economy is different. Their, you know, social relationships may be different. And therefore, it requires a very contextualized perspective into how these recovery happens. And the recovery in local businesses may be very different in the current COVID times as compared to before. Let me share a little bit of Japan's history, Japan's case. So this is the chart of number of people who died from disasters from 1945, so the end of Second World War, until recently. And as you see from this graph, the number of people who died from disasters from actually typhoons or the flooding, torrential rain, were in the number of thousands in the early days. But Japan made intentional investments to reduce the casualties from hydrometeorological disasters. And this was through strengthening the infrastructure around the river water management. But there are also consequences, because now, so we wanted to make sure that the more people could live in the city area or in the surrounding area, and is evident in places near Tokyo, for example. So that also meant we had to fill the river and make that river narrower so that more people could live in the surroundings. But in order to do that, if you make the river narrower, the water level will be higher. And so we had to build a higher and higher dike. And as a consequence, what's happening now is that more than 50% of our population and 75% of our national assets are under river water level. So you can imagine when the flooding happens in Japan nowadays, what would happen? So we also see these flooding, and because the river water level is much higher than these residential area, it's difficult for water to escape or go away. So it sort of becomes a stagnant water, and people need to pump out this water back to the river. So there are these consequences of whatever policy that we decide to take. There are these consequences that we need to understand. Now in Japan though, hazard map plays a key role in linking the government plans and community plans. So, and almost all municipalities now in Japan has the hazard map on flooding, for example. When looking at disaster risks, we also need to look at both the vulnerabilities and the capacities, as well as the exposure to the hazard. So these are sort of like underlining risk factors, vulnerabilities and capacity of the communities that are facing these disasters, which is often not mentioned in these hazard maps in Japan. But in the community-based maps, like this one, this is a case from our colleagues from Philippines, from an organization called NASA Caritas Philippines. This is a community map that they make with the community, and it even captures the changes in the number of livestock owned by a community member. And it's really a big map. I've seen the actual one. It's like the whole of the wall is like a map. And people take pride in this. This is placed in the community hall, for example. And people take pride in having their assets and their conditions of the village being mapped out in a map like this, because it allows them to see what they're supposed to do when they face with these imminent disaster risks. Where do they escape to? Where's the safe route? And where are the people who require special assistance, who need early evacuation, for example? This is this more communities action perspective is becoming more and more of a focus in Japan nowadays. For example, on the left-hand side, what you see is the new warning level introduced a few years ago in Japan. Until at that time, we only had until level 4. So we only had level until the authorities say you must evacuate. But now we have a level 5. And level 5 means it's too late to evacuate. Don't evacuate. Just do whatever you can to save your life. And that's what it means. Because we also face with these annual flooding events where we see particularly the elderly who fail to escape or evacuate early. And for them, when the flood water already arrives, it's more dangerous for them to evacuate outside. And so for them, the safest thing to do is to go to the second floor of their house, if they have a second floor, and pray that the flood water doesn't exceed that level that they're staying. The other, and I'm sorry this is in Japanese, but on the right-hand side, what you see is a tool that's increasingly being popular nowadays by local authorities. It's called the My Timeline. And this is a tool that gets disseminated to every household. Even I received mine from our municipality. And this is sort of a mapping of actions depending on this warning level. So what would you do in the warning level 1? What would you do in the warning level 2? And what are the sort of vulnerable people that you have in your household? What are the specific needs that they require, and when they have to evacuate in order to stay safe? For example, my elderly member of my family may require maybe double the time in order to evacuate to a safe place. That means they probably need to evacuate when it's a warning level 2 or 3. 3 is the latest for them. Maybe for me, the 4 is the latest for me. But we need to think about when's the optimal timing. And so this My Timeline was quite significant and innovative in a way that it brought the paradigm shift. Until now, it was the communication about this evacuation was looking at this community as one. So, for example, the flood risk is imminent. Everyone in this village needs to evacuate. So it's a warning to everyone. But then this My Timeline is changing that paradigm in a way that we need to optimize the evacuation patterns according to the needs of the household or the condition of each household. And that's the trend that's happening in Japan nowadays. Now, at ADRN, Amoto-san is actually a chairperson of ADRN. And within ADRN, we're replanning our strategy now. The context is changing, environment is changing, and we need to re-strategize ADRN's action nowadays. And we're putting quite a lot of efforts, thinking into it. There are various issues that we need to tackle and we need to consider. But some of them are issues, but also it could pose as opportunities for us. So for example, like a new challenge of heat and displacement. We all know that for example, soil condition, soil fertility rate, the quality is deteriorating in many places. And therefore it's really putting pressure on people's livelihood. So how to protect people's livelihood from these risks at the same time as responding to life-saving needs of the people when it comes to, say, flooding, landslides, losing of their homes, etc. How do we go about the strengthening the local governance of risks tangibly? We've been focusing in this disaster management stakeholders in the region. We've been focusing on this risk governance. A lot of focus has been on the national level. We also talk a lot about the local level, but it's always becoming an issue at the local level, the lack of resources, lack of expertise. And in many local governments, they talk about this lack of resources and lack of expertise. But we just can't conclude it like that. We need to come up with a solution of how to strengthen the local governance of risk tangibly. Sorry, can you all hear me okay? There may be some disturbance of my network.
It was a little bit disturbed, Takeshi-san, but now you are back to normal.
Now I'm back. Okay, great. So how to tangibly just one second. How to tangibly strengthen the local risk governance is a key. Okay. And in order to do that, how to bring science to the people is also something that we need to think about. And this is where this concept of innovation actually comes in. Innovation for us is becoming not as a luxury, but it's a necessity. Because just like this simple graph, we've been generating these incremental improvements through the work that we all do. But the level of risks that we face is surpassing whatever incremental impact that we've been generating with the communities that we serve. And therefore, the impact that we used to generate, we need to have this breakthrough in transformation of that level of impact. For example, if we can prepare one village towards their new climate-related risks, we need to think about how to turn that one village into 100 or even 1,000. How to have this breakthrough in the transformation of impact is really required now. It's not a luxury anymore. It's a necessity. Everyone needs to think about that. And that's the reason why we have this hub on innovation, because we wanted to create this culture within ADRN and its membership that we need to really think about the solution to this. Okay, so conclusion. So when we think about the role of civil society, CSOs, towards these new normal era risks. There are three major pillars that comes to my mind. One is, first of all, we need to understand actual risk. Sometimes we fail to understand the actual risk because we only look at the hazard specific elements of things. We understand that the different vulnerabilities lie even in the same area. There is this complexity in the risk landscape, but people need to understand what is their imminent risk. And in order to do that, we need to bring science to the people. Science is not only for the scientist anymore. We need to bring science to the people intentionally. There needs to be a clarity on the needs of the target population and the timely localized support. Now, there are various stakeholders concerning this disaster management, from the community itself to the local governments to organizations. And different segments or sectors of the society have different roles. And they do have different respective roles. But oftentimes, their roles do not interlink automatically, although sometimes it should, with the shared vision of making the community safer, for example. There are lots of room for us to collaborate between different disciplines or different segments of the society. But this collaboration doesn't happen automatically. So there needs to be someone who produces these multi-sectoral partnership. There's also the role of private sector in all this as well, and investments into disaster risk reduction. And there's also an element of interlinkages between the existing institution services providers and disaster management stakeholders. For example, when we think about people living with disability, for example, in their daily life, they interact with people like social workers or the caretakers or the care homes or medical personnel. They don't interact with disaster management stakeholders, right? Disaster response professionals, for example. So disaster management stakeholders actually need to look at different social fabric, see who are providing existing services to whom, and how to collaborate with these people to make our disaster management more effective and embed it in the social fabric. This is something that we all need to think about, actually. I think we also have a role of the action mobilizer. So some people call it the last mile, but we need to link the government aspirations as well as with the community actions. At the end of the day, it's not the policy, that the paper-based policies that's important, but it's the actual tangible reduction of the risks and protection of people's lives and their livelihoods are our aspiration. So whatever that the plans that we have, we need to turn that into the community actions. The risk disclosure need to be done, and this links to the science, bring science to the people, but the risk needs to be communicated to the people, and the community needs to have this thinking of how to protect themselves, surroundings, their loved ones, their jobs, with the risks that's imminently that they're facing. And we need to promote the specific actions to save lives and assets in this complex risk landscape. At the end of the day, I truly believe disaster risk reduction is all about learning from yesterday for a safer tomorrow. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much for your patience in listening to me. I very much look forward to receiving any of your questions or comments so that we can engage in the discussion. Thank you so much.
Great, Takeshi-san. It was a wonderful, high quality almost 45 minutes. And thank you very much for presenting, covering rather a wide area, the entire Asia, as well as specifics of Japan and some of your lesson learned, and that must have generated a lot of queries. And I see several hands raised, and please, I want to see more hands raised, but let's go first to Dr. Ramesh Tuladhar. Sir, your question, you can ask the question in person now. Over to you,
Dr. Japanese expert, thank you so much. It was really useful to all Nepalese and also the Asians as well. So I would like to ask you as an expert, I think you must have known about our latest Disaster Risk Management Act. And this act has provided lots of, new areas, as well as particularly the establishment of National Disaster Risk Reduction Authority at the government Ministry of Home Affairs under. And just today from the news, I could say that there were some sort of, quick response at the Melamchi, Sindhu Palchok area and many other areas. That was a quick enough. So in all this respect, how do you evaluate our Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act 2017 or 18, I think. If you can throw some light on our latest Disaster Risk Reduction Act, it will be very useful to us.
Okay. May I respond, Ahmad-san?
Yes, please. Takeshi-san, that's your call.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your question. And I think it's a very interesting question. I don't know so much. I'm not going to say I'm an expert on the disaster management law in Nepal. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert either. But maybe I can share my few thoughts. In order for a law to be implemented on the ground, law influences things like guidelines or policies, and then these policies become specific sort of SOPs of various stakeholders, including ministries, in order for it to be implemented. Now, how frequently to revise those laws is really up to the people of Nepal. But what I can say as a good practice that I've seen in Japan is, for example, there's something called like a National Disaster Evacuation Guideline published by our Cabinet Office. And do you know how frequently it gets revised? It gets actually revised every year. Why? Because in each disasters, we learn something. We learn something unexpected. Now, all those unexpected things need to be embedded in these guidelines for us to implement. And therefore, that guideline gets revised every year. Some of our laws, like sediment disaster prevention law, that was revised after a significant landslide disaster in Hiroshima some years back. And that actually led to a legal sort of revision of the law. But we had to see, hundreds of people die from that disaster in order for us to take action. So it's really up to people in Nepal how frequently you revise the law. But I think that the body of policies that complement the law needs to be revised or relooked every time there's a disaster, I think.
Thank you, Takeshi-san. But something related to this question is there in the chat box I see, and I will come to other hand raised a little bit later, and I will surely give preference to the younger generation and mid-career persons or early career persons. But then there is a question, Takeshi-san, Japan is doing great in responding to COVID-19. It would be interesting for us to learn how the support mechanism of self-help, mutual assistance, and public support work for preparedness, risk reduction, and response to COVID-19. That's number one. And related is, I mean, how you have changed the plans and policy and plans commensurate to the impact that was felt from COVID-19. So two questions. One is on COVID-19, how did you have changed the plan? Have you, if any? And the other one is how the support mechanisms are changing. You have got the famous self-help, mutual assistance, and public support. Over to you, Takeshi-san.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a very good question, a complex one to answer, actually. First of all, I'm not entirely sure whether Japan is doing great on COVID response. And there are elements that we're doing great, I think. For example, if you come to Japan and look at the city area, maybe more than 90% of the people are wearing masks. Hand washing and the mask wearing is quite common. Government asks for more than 70% of the jobs to go on remote, which I think only about 30% of the companies followed. So we're not doing so great. We're in the fourth wave of the COVID. But given that we are in the fourth wave, maybe it means that we've been trying to sort of re-strategize our COVID strategy each time we face with a wave, maybe. I'm not a health expert, so I can't comment on that, but and you're right, we have in disaster management in Japan, we have the self-help, mutual help, and a public help, the three layers. I think to an extent it worked well because people losing livelihood, for example, there are so many people who lost jobs, and many people had to rely on this official support mechanism, like compensation from the government. But at the same time, there are people who lend their hands in this difficult time as their colleagues, as their neighbors. This communal support structure really kicked in where government cannot reach. So I think it was wonderful to see this. But I mean, COVID-19 is really posing a significant challenge in Japan as well. So I'm not gonna claim that we're doing so well. It's still ongoing challenge that we're facing. Sorry, I don't think I really answered the question, but
that was great. That was great, Takeshi-san. Now, may I go over to again with my criteria? I request others to have some patience. We'll continue the discussion